Hello, everyone. This is Zoot. Today, we're going to talk about one of the risk assessment method that we all know pretty well, the LEC method. There is another name of LEC method. I don't know if you've ever heard about that. It's called a Graham method because originally this method was first introduced by Kenneth Graham and Gilbert Kinney. So these two guys were safety experts at the US Navy Weapons Center specializing in explosive safety. So it's more likely that this method was first developed to evaluate the explosion risk. And in 1980, they published a paper called A Practical Safety Analysis System for Hazards Control. And it described that three contributing factors are identified and a numerical value assigned to each. An overall risk score is determined as a product of the three individual factors. And here it clearly stated that this method had already been proposed early in 1976 by Kinney. I think it's the same person, and Wirus, and even earlier in 1971 by someone called Fine, who suggested a similar approach. So internationally, this method is called Fine-Kinney method because Fine was the first person who introduced the idea, and Kinney was the one who later expanded and promoted the method. So from that perspective, calling this method a Graham method alone might raise a few eyebrows. At least Fine and Kinney would have something to say about it. I compared the method described in the paper with the one that we currently use. The criteria for evaluating each factor are almost identical, both in terms of the numerical value and the corresponding descriptions. So it's fair to say that the LEC method comes from this paper. So LEC method is widely used in manufacturing industries. So let's talk about its strengths and weaknesses. Its biggest advantage is that it's simple and practical. You just assign scores to each factor and then multiply them together, then you'll wind up with the final score, the final risk score. So easy to understand and easy to use. Let's focus on its disadvantages. I think there are two big ones. The first one is that the likelihood rating is highly subjective. If you look at the criteria like might well be expected and quite possible, both suggest a fairly high likelihood. In practice, though, the difference between them is not that clear. And in the ratings, one is rated as 10 and another as 6, but the numerical gap between them does not reflect how similar those two situations are in real life. And the same problem exists with other categories like only remotely possible and conceivable but highly unlikely. Both suggest a pretty low likelihood, but either options could be justified for many hazards. So this means that the final risk score depends heavily on people's judgment. So this subjectivity can directly affect the final risk level. The second disadvantage is that LEC puts too much weight on exposure frequency when determining the overall risk level. Because by definition, risk is a combination of two factors, likelihood and severity. So if an accident is very likely to happen and the consequences are very severe, so we generally consider it a high risk. But LEC introduces a third factor, which is exposure frequency. So if exposure happens infrequently, so the final score can drop quite a bit. which can lead to underestimating the actual risk. Let's take confined space entry as an example. Many confined spaces, like underground wastewater tanks, might only be entered once a year or twice a year. So that means the exposure frequency is pretty low, let's say a score of 1. But the likelihood of the accident is still quite high, a score of 6. And the consequence could be catastrophic. There might be multiple fatalities. So the score would be 15. So this gives you the final risk score only 90, which is classified as moderate risk. But we know that based on many government issued risk catalogs, confined space is classified as high risk. So in this case, LEC definitely underestimates the actual risk. So to wrap things up, LEC method is simple and practical, but we need to use it with caution. There are two key points to keep in mind. The first one is that the likelihood ratings is highly subjective, and different people can look at the same hazard and come up with totally different ratings. And the second is for those infrequent exposures, LEC method may underestimate their real risk. So LEC method should really be seen as just a supporting tool, not an absolutely decision maker. And when the numbers don't align with what we know from our experience, we should not blindly follow them. As always, it comes down to professional judgment and case by case analysis. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for listening. I see you next time.